Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you so much. Ooh, mic falling away. Thank you so much to the folks the intrepid, who have come out this evening to enjoy what I think will be a really, really fascinating program. And to everyone watching online, this is being live streamed as well, and I'll mention is being recorded this evening and will be able to live on our website going forward. So to everyone watching online and here in person with us at Next Stage, thank you so much for coming out this evening. My name is Jeremy Ebersole. I'm the communications specialist for the Landmark Trust USA, and I just wanted to very briefly, before we get into the sugar of our, the meat of our program, but we'll call it the sugar of our program. I wanted to give a brief introduction to our organization and some of the fun things that we're doing and that we have coming up for everyone. So we, again, our mission right here on the screen for you, we are a 501c3 nonprofit historic preservation organization. We have a mission to preserve and restore historic properties through creative and sustainable uses for public enjoyment, education, and inspiration. And we do this in a number of ways. One of the primary ways is as stewards of these 5 fabulous historic properties where guests can come and stay overnight and really experience history firsthand. These are restorations that we do often from the ground up, that are really museum quality according to National Park Service standards, and really give folks the opportunity to really experience history and do things like sit at the desk where Rudyard Kipling wrote the Jungle Book, and all of our properties have really fascinating histories. And so we have our Nalaka, where Rudyard Kipling lived, his carriage house, our Dutton farmhouse, and our sugar house, apropos for this evening. Here in Dummerston, and then the Amos Brown House in Whitingham, and then we're also the owners of our certified B Corp subsidiary, Scott Farm, which is an heirloom apple orchard and does a number of other products. They have 130 varieties of heirloom apples that they sell at Scott Farm. And so one of the other ways that we fulfill that mission is through educational programs, such as this one. We just got through with our Sugar House open house, so where guests could come in and visit the Sugar House and learn about the history and the restoration of that fabulous property that was a working sugar house for many, many years. And then this program this evening, we also have our biggest event of the year, which is our Nalaka Estate and Rhododendron Tour coming up. It's always the first weekend of June, so June 4th and 5th. This year. Tickets for that are $25 and are on sale now, and that allows folks to wander through these fabulous properties at their own pace, enjoy the grounds and the gardens. Folks often bring picnic lunches while they're there. It's just a really fun time to get to experience Nalaka there, and is a major fundraiser for us. Again, as a nonprofit, we do depend on donations to help us do much of the work that we do. Overnight stays at our properties cover some of our expenses, maintenance and some operations, but they don't cover capital expenses, some of the big things that need to happen when you're stewarding old or historic properties, or with expansion or the programming like this. And so we depend on revenue from things like the Rhododendron Tour and donations to help us fulfill this mission and continue to do this good work here and expand beyond where we are now going forward. So if you feel compelled to help support our mission, we would certainly value that opportunity. There are donation boxes outside and opportunities to pick up some products there. Other ways that you can support the work that we're doing, obviously following us on social media, signing up for our email list. We do have postcards, handbooks for all of the landmark properties, both here and in the UK, that are out for sale in the lobby. Note cards, historic postcards from Nalaka. And we also have partnered with Barefoot Farm, which is our neighbor at Scott Farm that taps the sugar bush in the area and sells there from right beside our Scott Farm offices. And they have some maple syrup for sale, so if you're feeling very sugary after this evening, take some of the Barefoot Farm's maple syrup home with you. We also have a raffle that we're doing now, and if you're watching online or here, you have until tomorrow at noon to enter our raffle for one night at the Sugar House. So again, if you're inspired and want to stay in the Sugar House and experience all of this, I was just talking with our speaker and said that you can almost smell the maple coming out of the beams of wood there in the Sugar House. So it's really a special little place that Sleeps Too. And so we have a raffle going on now, $10 for one entry or $20 for 3 entries, and we'll be picking the winner tomorrow at noon. So get in there soon, and that's available online on our website. And then we do have an education survey also. So see those links up here on the screen, our education survey, just reaching out to the community and trying to understand better what our audience would like to see as far as education programs or things like this, or kind of how can we best reach out to the community and do educational programming that is valuable for the community. And of course, visit us online at landmarktrustusa.org. So to wrap up my brief section here, I just want to say that we're really excited to welcome Michael Lange this evening to present the many meanings of maple in Vermont. I want to thank Vermont Humanities for this program. This is a Vermont Humanities event that we are proud to host at the Landmark Trust USA. And the Vermont Humanities asked us to talk a little bit about them as the sponsors of the event, which I'm happy to do. This program is sponsored by Vermont Humanities through its Speakers Bureau program. In addition to providing public talks, the Vermont Humanities sponsors book discussion programs, a wide array of literacy programs, and other humanities events statewide. Vermont Humanities seeks to engage all Vermonters in the world of ideas, foster a culture of thoughtfulness, and inspire a lifelong love of reading and learning. Also want to thank Next Stage for hosting us, for those who are here in person, and opening up this beautiful space, which is another example of the power of historic preservation to save this fabulous old building, and we're really grateful for hosting this accessible space for us here this evening. And lastly, I'll just note the little link there at the very bottom is also from Vermont Humanities. They have asked that you share your thoughts on this program with them afterwards as well. So they would like your feedback also on the program that you see tonight. And with that, I will finish my section and turn it over to Michael to dive into the many meanings of maple in Vermont. Thanks so much.
Howdy, everybody, and thank you for coming out. I also would like to thank the Landmark Trust, Next Stage for hosting, and the Humanities Council for supporting this. I love getting out and talking to the community. Everybody who does this for a living says that, oh, I love getting out in the community, and I'm sure they all mean it, I'm sure they're all sincere, but I really, really mean it. And I'll tell you why. It's because I'm an ethnographer. What that means is I do research by going out and talking with people. I get out in communities, I talk with actual human beings about their actual lived experiences, their thoughts, their feelings, their beliefs, to try to learn, to try to understand who people are, what matters to them, what's meaningful to them. If you think about culture, at its root is always what matters, what's meaningful. Jeremy mentioned this building that we're standing in right now. This was a win for historic preservation, absolutely. But it's only possible to be a win if a space like this matters to people, if it's meaningful. And that is at the heart of what I want to learn when I go out into the community and talk with folks. I want to know what matters to you, what's meaningful to you. And that process is, it's simultaneously fascinating and just a little bit icky. And I'm going to use a technical term there. And what I mean by that is, I used to sell things door to door in a previous life. When you're selling things door to door, you cold call and you knock on someone's door and then you say, oh, if you enjoyed my presentation today, would you mind talking to 3 of your friends and letting me know their information? I'll go talk with them and knock on your door and your door. And Being an ethnographer is sometimes a little like that. For me, it wasn't selling things door to door, it was showing up with a notepad and a tape recorder. Hey, I want to learn a little bit about maple syrup. Sit down, talk with me if you would. That's wonderful, lovely, thank you, I appreciate it. Now, could you talk to 3 of your friends and forward my information on? There's a little bit of a about it. There's an extractive quality to it. This is an opportunity for me to take some of what I have been given, because it is a gift, the knowledge, the wisdom, the experiences, the expertise that people have shared with me, and try to give it back in some form or fashion. So I genuinely do love coming out and talking to the community. So I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you being here if you're joining us virtually or joining us live and in the flesh. I want to talk a little bit about how I got to be the person who stands up on a stage and talks about the meanings of maple syrup. First confessions, I'm not from Vermont. Second confessions, I don't make maple syrup. There are a whole lot of people who have studied maple. Decades of people who have studied maple from all kinds of angles. The chemistry of it, the agronomy of it, the economics of it, the climatology of it. When I got to Vermont, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second, when I got to Vermont, I was kind of surprised that nobody had really studied in an academic way the culture of it. That meanings part of it, not in any great depth. There are little bits and pieces here and there. But I thought, well, there's a niche that I can fill. And I wanted to fill that because I came to Vermont about 16 years ago for a job. I teach at a little school up in Burlington. I teach college. And I was new to New England. I had not set foot anywhere in New England before I came for my job interview. I'm from the Midwest. I was born and raised in Ohio. I went to graduate school in Wisconsin. I did archaeology in Illinois and Iowa and Missouri and places all around. Very much Midwesterner. Coming here, I realized I don't know this place. Now, I only know one way to know a place, and that's ethnographically, by getting out in the community and talking with people. So I needed some kind of hook. I needed something to knock on people's doors and say, hey, do you want to talk about X? Now, when I first got here, I didn't start studying maple. What I started studying was community cookbooks. And the reason for that is, in a previous research life, I studied narrative, stories. The stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell each other. And I don't mean, let's all sit down and hear the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. I mean the everyday stories that we expediently, fluidly, sometimes unconsciously sort of swap with one another. Hey, what'd you do this weekend? The response is going to be a story. And so I spent a good few years studying stories and how they make identities, individual, group, sometimes conflicting. I studied narrative. I wanted to transition a little bit into studying food for perhaps obvious reasons. I was a little bit well, I was a chicken. I'll just put it that way. I was a chicken because I had a background studying narrative, and I didn't have a background studying food, and I didn't want to pretend that, oh, I'm going to study food because I know all about it. I wanted a sort of transitional stage, so I thought, okay, what's a little bit narrative and a little bit food? Cookbook. If anybody's ever cracked open a cookbook, you'll see it's about maybe 30% recipes. It's about 40% really big pictures, and the rest of it is stories. This is a recipe I found at a little cafe in Lagos, and I loved it so much I had to talk to the chef. This is a recipe that was handed down from my great-great-grandfather, and he always made it on Easter or whatever it may be. The stories are parts of the cookbooks. They're an important part of the cookbook. You don't find a cookbook that doesn't have narrative in it anymore. So I thought, all right, that's a place where I can study food, but I can still hedge my bets and talk about what I know, the story part. So I started studying community cookbooks. Turned out, wasn't that interesting. What I realized, probably not quickly enough, but what I realized was the thing that the people are narrating in the cookbooks was maple. A community cookbook in Vermont, they all have maple in them. It's a particularly meaningful thing too. People don't just talk about, oh, I got some maple syrup from the people who live up the road. People talk about, my grandparents used to boil over a fire outdoors in an iron kettle, and we always got our maple from this one particular place up in the Northeast Kingdom. And they narrated the maple intensely. there was a lot of meaning that was captured in those narrations. And images like this evoke something in people. They capture something that people want to narrate. What is it? And that's actually not a rhetorical question. I'm asking y'all, sitting in the audience in front of me. When you see this, what story rings in your head? What ideas come into your head? What does this mean? Hard work, absolutely. Hard work with sweet rewards. Double entendre intended. Nice. Absolutely. What else? Cold, very much so. Vermont, it's got to be cold. If it ain't cold, it ain't Vermont. Yeah? What else? What do you see here? What does this image look like to you? What does it feel like to you? Rural, very much so. If you think about all the stuff you're saying, hard work, and I think the cold and the hard work very much go together, because cold means one thing when you're inside cozied up by a fireplace. Cold means something else when you're out in it hauling buckets. But hard work, hard physical graft in the cold, with the sweet reward, in a particular kind of place, a rural place. Vermont prides itself on its rurality. All of that doesn't just say maple syrup, it says Vermont. There's something very particularly Vermonty about that combination. Now, the way that that gets communicated in an image like this is with things like the dude in the check coat, a wooden stave bucket, a horse team, the buckets hanging on all the trees. This is an evocative image. This is an image that we see again and again. Wooden stave bucket, horse team, dudes in check coats, buckets hanging on the trees. This is the story that sugaring, that maple syrup tells to Vermont, that Vermont tells to itself about maple. Has anybody ever had any maple syrup that came out of a wooden stave bucket? It's a trick question. No, you haven't. Unless you've made it yourself in your kitchen, I would bet one of my very meager paychecks that no, you haven't. Because it's illegal to make maple syrup on wooden stave buckets. It's impossible to keep them clean. Year over year, the sap will seep into the wood, and that doesn't go away. You can't scrub that off. So it's been illegal for quite some time to make maple syrup in a wooden stave bucket. But that's the image. That's the image. Now, these buckets are metal. They're galvanized. Also illegal, by the way. They're galvanized. They're hanging in a woods. This feels a little bit more sort of present day, perhaps, than an image like this. This has an old-timey feel to it. It's rural, yes, but it's not just rural today. It's a rural past. There's something kind of evocative. There's something kind of nostalgic, maybe, about it. This one feels a little bit closer to today. But still, there's something quite romantic about it. I'm not a very good photographer, but I took this picture, and these are snowflakes. So this is sap buckets in the snow. There's something kind of, you talked about the cold, the hard graft that happens in the cold. Well, the cold has a romantic aspect to it in Vermont. Again, if it ain't cold, it ain't Vermont. There's something about living here, being here, existing here, that you need to, in some way, embrace the cold. And so the falling snow kind of captures that aspect of Vermontiness, combined with the hard work and the presumed hoped-for sweet reward. And obviously the rurality. We're out in the woods here. We're out in the woods here. We're out in the woods here. This is not something that people are picturing happening in suburban landscapes. Although interestingly, maple is made in suburban landscapes. I've talked to sugar makers all over Vermont. I've talked to sugar makers all over the maple making world. You can make maple syrup as far west as Minnesota, Nebraska, as far south as like North Carolina, as far east as Newfoundland. Although interestingly, there are no maple trees that are native to Newfoundland, no tappable maples, but enough of them have been landscaped in to primarily suburban settings that there are tappable maples there in enough quantity. You can make maple syrup in Newfoundland. I lived in Newfoundland for a little while, and there were quite a few people who were making maple. I was surprised. I tasted a lot of it. Some of it's good. Not all, but some. There's a technique to it. But this evokes that rurality, that hard work, that cold in Vermont. This is all the outside. The slowly dripping sap into the bucket. That little pink, pink, pink of the sap dripping in. That sound is evocative for a lot of people. Then you take it indoors. And I know this picture looks blurry, but it's actually not. Again, I'm not a good photographer, but what you're seeing there is steam. How many of us have been in a sugar house during a boil? Now I'm seeing some shaking heads, a couple of nodded heads. Wow. If you ever get a chance to, oh, for the love of all that's good and holy, do it. It will overload every single sense that you have in a beautiful way. If you're in a sugar house when there's a boil going on, obviously you've got the site, the sort of view of, this is a part of an evaporator, the big machine where they make maple syrup, called the front pan. This is the bit at the very front where the sap has almost become maple syrup. And in the front pan right up here, you can see that's a big raging boil. You can see that, but you can also hear it. You can hear the thunderous is probably too strong a word to use, but it's an intense noise and it's constant and it sort of fills your ears. The smell, oh my sweet goodness, the redolence of a sugar house during a boil, it pervades your nose to the point where you can taste it in the back of your throat. And there's so much steam you can feel it on your skin. You come out wonderfully moisturized. You're going to smell like maple syrup for a week. All of that is part of the experience of being in the sugar house. And all of that becomes part of the story of maple syrup for somebody who has experienced it. The evaporator. This is a comparatively small evaporator. I'll show you a picture of another one that's slightly larger in just a few minutes. But no matter the size of the evaporator, you have to take a whole lot of sap and turn it into a little bit of syrup. Does anybody know the ratio? That's the number that often gets quoted. And yeah, I'm going to go ahead and fess up. I led you into a little bit of a trap there. 40 to 1 is a shorthand that gets used pretty much across the maple world. The idea of 40 to 1 is less about a mathematical accuracy and more an attempt to get across that hard work. How much resource and effort has to go into taking the stuff that comes out of the tree and transform it into the stuff that's in the bottle. The math actually works out a little bit differently. There are a lot of variables. People will talk about the rule of 86 or the law of 86. What that means is if you take the number 86 and you divide it by the percentage of sugar that's in the sap that comes out of the tree, that tells you how many gallons you need to make 1 gallon of syrup. A couple things wrong with that though. That 86 number is calculated when syrup had to have a slightly lower percentage of sugar in it in order to be legally called syrup. Now it's a little bit higher, so it's not exactly 86. And each tree is going to give you a different percentage of sugar in the sap. People will say a good sugar maple will give you 2% coming out of the tree. So in that liquid, the sap, 2% of it is sugar solids. But at the beginning of a season and the end of a season, that number may vary. The exact same genus and species of tree on a slope that faces north may give a different percentage from the same genus and species across the valley facing south. There are a lot of variables. And so that rule of 86, which needs a little bit of tweaking to begin with, is going to have to be divided by all kinds of numbers based on what sugar is coming out of the tree. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can make maple syrup in suburban settings. I talked to one sugar maker who he lived in a suburban sort of neighborhood, and he tapped the trees up and down his street and sort of the next street over. He told me that some of his trees, he didn't own them, but the landowners, the people who owned the places, let him tap. Some of the trees that he tapped would give 7% sugar in the sap, which is astronomical. 2% is a pretty good, reliable yield from a sugar maple. He said he got 7%, and I was like, ooh, and I asked him why. And his response was, I think it's all the dog walkers. Dogs would come along and irrigate the trees. He was mostly joking, but I don't know if he was 100% joking when he said that. But anywho, he was getting a much higher percentage coming out of the tree. So he's not going to need 40 gallons of that anywhere near it to make a gallon of syrup. However, that 40-to-1 number persists. Why? Why do you think? That's another one of those non-rhetoricals. What do you think? It stays alive in the mythos and the culture. It's easy to remember. And the second answer very much informs the first. It's easy to remember, therefore it helps it stay alive. It's, as I said, it's a shorthand. It's an easy number to remember. And 40 is an evocative number. It's just, it feels big. There's something about 40 that in a lot of cultures symbolically just feels like a lot in a sort of diffuse way. And it is easy to remember, especially if you hear it in every sugar house that you visit. Now, if you walked into a sugar house or talked to a sugar maker and said, how much sap do you need for a gallon? Well, if you take the rule of 86 and you modify it for the higher percentage of syrup and then you divide it by, you're going to zone out in 2 minutes and you're probably not going to buy a quart of syrup. 40-to-1, ooh, hard work, in the cold, ooh, I want some of that sweet reward. That translates. That's a story. That's a narrative that sugaring, that maple sort of narrates to itself and to us. Every sugar maker knows that it ain't 40-to-1. Many sugar makers will tell you it's 40-to-1 because it's not about mathematical accuracy, it's about evoking the hard work, evoking this reward is sweet because. All of that is part and parcel of the maple experience, the meanings of maple. I wrote a book on this. I called the book Meanings of Maple, plural, because in culture, meaning doesn't exist in isolation. We all have and make meanings constantly. And they intersect with one another. They inflect one another. They inform one another. Sometimes they contradict one another. People who study psych will call that cognitive dissonance. It's not exactly what that is. It's just multiple meanings that we then have to negotiate. But that's actually a very normal human thing. That's a meaning. 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 These are all meanings that we make with maple, that maple narrates to us. The cold, hard work out in the snow, the wooden stave buckets, the horse teams, the redolent steam of a sugar house in the boil. All of those are meanings that we get told, that sugaring tells to itself and tells to the public. It even tells us that in the packaging. How many people have seen one of these kinds of labels? They're quite common. What do you see here? What do you see in these images? Yeah, there's sugar houses. There's sugar house there, sugar house there. Very old-timey looking, red clapboard. Yeah, what else? This is just to say what you see around. Yeah. Yeah, we've got the hard work, we've got the effort. You got the horse team over here. You got a dude with a yoke over his shoulders here. It doesn't get much harder work symbolically than we're going to hang these big heavy buckets filled with liquid over your shoulders, and you're going to have to walk them back to the sugar house. And look at the perspective there. That sugar house isn't terribly close to this dude. So he's got a bit of a walk ahead of him. Red check coat. Red check coat. Also, dude, It's a very masculine image. Women, sugar. Always have, always will. But the imagery, the narrative is often the lone male. Sometimes it's not lone. Sometimes the dude will have, you know, a couple boys out in the woods working with him. But very often, it's a lone male image. That becomes part of the narrative. There's a kind of, this gets back to the rurality, the fact that it's a very rural narrative. The lone man conquering nature, the sort of Indiana Jonesy lone explorer, somebody hacking through the jungle with a machete kind of thing. That sort of narrative is part of Maple's story that it tells itself, Maple's story that it tells us. Women, sugar, always have, always will. But the narrative makes it very much, no, it's a guy in a red check coat and his horses. Yeah, absolutely. Place is hugely important in this. This, again, gets back to the rurality in a way. It's not just a generic, generalized rural. And Vermontiness is a big part of that cell. I mean, it says pure Vermont of it. It's a bucket. It's a bucket, not hanging off a tree. It's hanging off Vermont. You poke a hole in the side of Vermont, and what comes out? Maple syrup. I mean, it doesn't get much more blatant than that. And I'm not critiquing that. I'm not criticizing that. That's good selling. Vermont, if you scratch Vermont, it bleeds maple, is a pretty powerful set of images. It's a pretty powerful story to tell. And if you want to do that scratching, it's going to take a lot of hard work. You need the horse team. You need that hard graft in the snow. Yeah, you'll notice these are not summer scenes either. There's snow on the ground. There's steam rising up. That evocation of place, that maple is ours, of this place and of the people who live in this place. So there's a kind of acclaimed ownership. It's also a very colonial narrative. Ours is very much understood as European American settlers / conquerors. The Abenaki, who without any question at all made and boiled maple long before anybody from Europe showed up. There are some people who will argue that point. No, the Abenaki were boiling before anybody else showed up here. There's good narrative evidence, there's good archaeological evidence from all across the upper Midwest all the way into this part of what's now the US and Canada. But they're not part of the narrative either. It's a very particular sort of colonial narrative of the lone conqueror in the woods. He's not carrying a machete, but in this case, it's a yoke over his shoulders. This is a bottle from Quebec. It's actually not a bottle, it's a can. But it's from Quebec. You can see the French up there, sirop d'érable. Pardon my French pronunciation, it's not nearly as good as it ought to be. Very similar imagery though. So this is not a particularly Vermont thing. Horse team, hard graft. About the only obvious difference is it's a green check coat instead of a red check coat. But a lot of the imagery is very much part parcel. It's very much the same. Now, all of that hard work, loner, doing it for himself, which sort of translates to doing it for ourselves, it connects people to place and it connects to that rural, we're just in our own little corner of the world. And maple is this hard work in our climate that yields the sweet reward, and here, would you mind having a quart? Ooh, sorry, one too many. What shape are these actual bottles? Don't worry about the label, but the bottles themselves, what are they shaped like? Why are they shaped like that? Yeah, they're shaped like old crockery containers, old stoneware, quite heavy. You can see this little sort of notch up here at the top, the kind of loop handle. That's evoking stoneware. Does that sound like stoneware to you? Injection molded plastic. Why shape them like this then? How does that fit into the narrative? It's tradition. There's a loaded term if I've ever heard one. What do you mean it's tradition? Yep, absolutely. It's just as much as the dude in the red check coat doesn't exist, but is the way we were, quote unquote. The crockery vessel is the way we were. You got 2 dimensions there. Actually, you got 3 dimensions. You got the people, and you got the place, which you talked about. Now you got time. We've been doing it this way. This is the way we do it. This is the way we did it. This is the way we're always going to do it. Even if we have to shape an injection molded plastic bottle like an old crockery vessel. Now again, none of this is critique. We narrate stories to ourselves all the time about everything. I did it 14 times before breakfast this morning. It's just the way humans act. It's what we do. So I'm not saying this is bad, eradicate this. Absolutely not. But paying attention to it is at the very least interesting, maybe even fascinating, because it's in those narrations where we find meanings, where we make meanings. Now, these are a couple of other bottles. Imagery's a little bit different on these. There's no red check coat. There's no dude at all. There's kind of you can sort of see in the background, there's a little bit of a sugar house. There's a sugar house here. But it's very much more impressionistic. It's very much more, hey, by the way, this was made in the woods, as opposed to, we're in the woods. We're deep in the woods. We're in deep in the woods with this particular guy. Here it's more, hey, there are woods involved. A little bit more generalized. Evoking less the hard graft in the deep snow of Vermont and more nature. Why do you reckon this imagery might have, well, actually I'll give a little bit away. Imagery like this is becoming more and more prominent on maple bottles. Why? Why do you think? In order to get you there, let's prime the pump a little bit. For whom is this a powerful image? What do you have to be, or what do you have to know in order for this to be a meaningful meaning? Someone from Vermont, or from not very far away, to even recognize that that is Vermont? Yeah, absolutely. Think of it kind of linguistically. If somebody says something to me in a language I don't understand, it's not going to be meaningful to me. But if I know that language, or I know a little bit of that language, I can make meaning with it. If somebody says Vermont to me with a map, and I don't know what Vermont looks like, I'm just going to think that's a really weird looking tree. So this is going to speak to a Vermonter, or to somebody from New England, or maybe somebody from the East. You can probably scale it back a ways and still get a little bit of reliable, oh, I think that's Vermont. You know, it helps state of Vermont, pure Vermont. Here, you've got Vermont on the label, and even what Vermont tastes like, which is just another way of saying that. But it doesn't take the kind of geography knowledge of knowing what it looks like on the map. It's a little bit more generalized again, kind of panned back a little bit. And then here, what's going on here? Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, everybody who's putting this stuff in bottles wants you to buy a pint, a quart, or whatever of syrup. And that's actually an interesting aspect to it as well. As I said, I've talked to sugar makers all over the maple world. And I ask them, what does maple mean to you? For many of them, hard work, the cold, the sweet reward, our rural home, this connection between place and people and time. But a lot of sugar makers also said, yeah, it's economic. It puts shoes on my kids' feet every year. It buys my kids textbooks every year. And they weren't shy about that, which is interesting in and of itself. A lot of people, when you are looking at this kind of narrative, this kind of imagery, to put a dollar sign next to that feels, I'll go back to that technical word, icky. It feels somehow a violation of the nostalgia, sometimes somehow a violation of the romanticism of it, but not for sugar makers. In a way, it's kind of like Every sugar maker knows 40 to 1 is not how the math actually works out unless by accident, but that's the story they tell. Every sugar maker knows, yes, this nostalgic, romantic, maybe even romanticized narrative is part of maple in a real way and in a kind of let's just trade in the realm of shared meanings way. But they're also quite happy to recognize, and I sell it. The economic aspect is not a violation for sugar makers. It's not somehow letting down the romantic notion. Both of them exist in their mind. And again, it's not a cognitive dissonance, it's just they make multiple meanings, and those meanings inflect one another. I will tell you it's 40 to 1, because if I tell you the real full mathematical story, you're going to try to do a geometry proof or work the algebra out, and you're going to get bored and you're going to go away. I'm going to evoke for you, and you're going to buy some syrup. They are just wanting to sell the syrup. I personally like putting this one in, especially when I'm talking in Vermont, because I grew up in Ohio. In the first couple of decades of the 20th century, Ohio was the leader in the production of maple syrup. There's still a decent amount of maple syrup made in Ohio, not a lot. Vermont far and away makes the most in the US now. Does anybody know who makes the most? What chunk of geography makes the most maple at the moment? Give you a hint. It's Quebec. Easily Quebec. Quebec makes better than 70% of all the maple syrup in the world every year. Has done for quite a while. Now, Quebec has certain advantages. They've got the Confederation, which is an enormous cooperative sort of economic entity. They also have more land. Quebec's just bigger than Vermont. But Quebec makes far and away the most in the world. Vermont makes far and away the most in the US. But here's a little tidbit that I love. Quebec is number one. If you took Franklin County, Vermont, all by itself, it would be number two. Franklin County, Vermont makes more than every other state in the US and every other province in Canada except for Quebec. So Vermont has a little bit of righteousness, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but a little bit of validity on their side when saying, Vermont is at the center of maple too. It's not just all about Quebec. There is something that is particularly Vermonty about maple as well. But it wasn't always that way. Ohio used to be the center of US maple production, to the point that a couple of the companies that make material, evaporators and other equipment that are centered here now used to be in Ohio. And that's just a little bit of my own jingoistic pride in saying, hey, Ohio used to be cool too. But I mean, the front cover of my book has an outline map of Vermont on it for a reason. You wouldn't sell this book if it had Ohio on the front cover. But you have these images that are sort of panned back from the lone dude in the red check coat with the horse team. They're more now just generalized nature. Now, I asked before, who does this speak to? And you quite rightly said, somebody comparatively local. Who does this speak to? A kind of generalized, natural. Who's that going to resonate with? Yeah, a global audience. Biggest growth markets in maple are very, very far away from where we're standing right now. Places like China, Japan, Australia, that's where the growth is. And this generalized evocation of the natural, that's going to resonate in Melbourne or Osaka. This, not so much. I don't know if anybody in Melbourne is going to look at that and go, oh, crikey, I want a bit of that for me. That was a terrible Australian accent, forgive me. But that's not going to resonate. That's not going to speak a language that somebody that far away is going to reliably be able to understand. But nature, yeah, that's a very understandable narrative. That's a very widely understandable narrative in places all over the world. So a lot of the marketing imagery of maple, and marketing is nothing but narratives. That's all it is. It's simply a communicative process. The marketing narratives are trying to get people to buy that quart of maple, and they're doing so by evoking nature in a way that a lot of people in a lot of parts of the world can go, oh yeah, that's something I like, or something I want distilled, quite literally in this case, into that bottle that I can carry around with me, pour on my pancakes. This is not the cover of a maple bottle. I would venture to say you're never going to see tubing on the cover of a maple bottle, at least not prominently. Tubing is how the vast, and I mean vast majority of maple sap gets to a place where it becomes maple syrup. Everybody likes the buckets. Everybody likes the imagery. There ain't no dude in the woods anymore with the oak over his shoulders. I know exactly one sugar maker, and I have talked to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sugar makers. I know exactly one who uses a horse to collect buckets. And he only does it on one little section of his land where there's a very steep kind of weird ravine that he can't get an ATV or a snow machine up to. So he uses a horse because his horse can get up there and collect a few buckets. He hasn't put that on tubing. I can't remember why he said he didn't put it on tubing. But there's one in the, again, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of sugar makers I've talked to, one who uses a horse team. People want this image. They want the wooden stave bucket. They want the dude in the red check coat. And to be sure, this is Vermont. You're going to see plenty of red check coats, but you're not going to see a whole lot of horse teams. You're not going to see wooden stave buckets. What you're going to see when you go into sugar woods is tubing. 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 This is what's getting your sap to the place where it becomes syrup. Again, plastic. This is not part of the narrative for a lot of the same reasons that a lot of the consumer side of things doesn't really talk about the dollars and cents of it. They want the nostalgic. They want the way we were, the way we've always been, the way we always will be, but we're not. They want the hard graft in the snow. They want the 40-to-1. You can't count gallons in these. You actually can. But if it's a bucket full, that's easily countable. If it's just flowing through tubing continuously, that doesn't really translate into a number quite as easily, at least not narratively. So this becomes the narrative of syrup the way it's made. But the consumer quite often still wants syrup the way we were. They want that nostalgia. They want that connection between place and people and time. They want the rurality. Well, this is still quite rural. But rural should be made of wood and rock. Rural shouldn't be made of plastic. I've met more than a couple of people in audiences like this who said, well, I never drink maple that's been made with plastic. I never do. And then I ask, well, who do you get your maple from? Well, I get it from blah, blah, blah. I said, yeah, you do. You do have maple that's made in plastic. Now, there are people who still produce with buckets. There are still people who don't have tubing. There's quite a lot of them. They're all quite small operations. It's just a labor thing. Has anybody ever hauled a bucket of sap? I don't recommend it. Not if you like your vertebra, anyway. They're heavy. I mean, it's literally a full bucket of water. It's about the same density as water. So they're not light, and you're not walking over nice paved paths. It's hard work. So there's just a physical limit to how many buckets you can really operationally have without getting a whole lot of physical help. And sugaring in Vermont is an agricultural operation. The agricultural industry is not replete with labor. It's hard getting people to do that kind of work because it's difficult, it's physical, and it's out in that cold. So there aren't people really who are making a whole lot of syrup. There are quite a few people, but they're not making a ton of syrup. The vast, vast, vast majority of syrup is coming through tubing. 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 This is what is turning sap into syrup. Now, it's actually not made in the tubes. It's made in an evaporator. Remember the little evaporator that I showed you earlier in the steamy picture? Well, this is a slightly larger one. And I say slightly very, very facetiously. This thing's enormous. This is larger, more expensive, kept in better condition than most cars I've ever owned, and one apartment I used to rent. And I'm not joking about that. I actually had an apartment that was smaller than this evaporator. It was a little tiny little bed sit. This is huge. This is enormous. And the amount of technology that's in here, the pan, well, the front pan is sort of here. There are pans back here. This whole bit over top is covering some of the pans and doing some work to inject efficiencies into the system. There are different ways you can do that. There are things like bubbler injection systems. You actually inject air into the sap. Steamaways, which sort of work like a turbo. They capture lost heat and recycle it. And there are all sorts of other things you can do. But this thing doesn't really scream rural dude in a red check coat, does it? I mean, that's shiny. This almost, if you didn't know what that was, you might think science fiction. You might think, well, that's the thing the alien comes out of at the beginning of the movie. That doesn't really scream rural. That doesn't really scream the lone person in the red check coat with the yoke over his shoulders. Anybody know what that is? It's a reverse osmosis machine. Does anybody know what reverse osmosis, RO, is? Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. It pulls water out of the sap. Reverse osmosis is a technology that comes to sugaring from the medical world. It's a way to purify water. There's a lot of technicality to it, but you basically push water through a very fine filter under very high pressure. There's more to it that I'm not doing it justice, but that's the basic idea. In the medical world, you want to push that water through this very fine filter under very high pressure in order to purify the water that comes out the other end and get rid of all the contaminants. Well, maple uses the exact same technology, except it wants to keep the contaminants, because the contaminants are sugar in this case. You're pushing the sap through a reverse osmosis filter, an RO, in order to increase the percentage of sugar that's left behind in the liquid. And in so doing, saving fuel when you have to boil away the rest of the water. These machines are expensive, but they save money because you're not boiling as long. In order to boil on these things, you need fuel, and you use quite a bit. That could be wood, that could be oil. You can even have electric evaporators, although electric ones are quite a bit smaller. But you need some sort of fuel, and fuel is expensive. RO speeds up the process by getting rid of some of the water before you have to boil it. Some people will run their reverse osmosis rigs up to maybe that 7 or 8% concentration that the one dude gets out of his suburban trees. Some people run it up to 18% sugar in solution. Some people run it up to 24% sugar in solution. In order to get to syrup, you need to be north of 60%, 65, 66, 67. It depends. It changes a little bit depending upon where you are. But you need to be about 66 or so % sugar in order for it to be syrup. So you can get pretty long way there with reverse osmosis before you put it over the boil. Again, technology, alien, shiny. Not the red check coat, not the horse team. But this is how the vast, vast, vast majority of the syrup that you're ever going to run into in your life, unless you know somebody who's making it for themselves, this is how the vast majority of that syrup is becoming syrup. It's running through these, and it's boiling on rigs, probably smaller than this. This one is gargantuan, to be fair. But a lot of them are a lot closer to this than they are to that little one that I showed you earlier in the steamy photo. I want to talk a little bit about this for a moment. First of all, can you read that from where you're sitting? Okay. So what you're seeing there are tasting notes. The one on the left is called the Map of Maple. This is an attempt to create as I said, a set of tasting notes for maple syrup. Because maple syrup tastes like the place it comes from in a very localized way. If you know what you're tasting for, you can tell immediately whether maple syrup comes from the west side of the Green Mountains or the east side of the Green Mountains. And if you know even more, you can tell, oh, this I think is from south of 4. Or I think that's Northeast Kingdom. And if you really know what you're doing, you can even say, oh, I think that's this valley, that's that valley. The syrups taste like the place they come from. It's a French concept called terroir. It comes into the English-speaking culinary world primarily through wine, but the French use it for all sorts of things, cheeses, breads, what have you. But the concept of terroir is literally, this tastes like the place comes from. These grapes were grown in this little pocketed valley that gets a lot of sea mist in the mornings, but gets a lot of bright sun in the afternoons. That's going to make the grapes taste this way, and therefore the wine to taste this way. Well, the same thing's true of the trees that are making maple syrup, maple sap. The tree that's on the north-facing slope and the south-facing slope, they're given different percentages of sugar in solution. They're also giving different flavors. The one facing south, it's probably going to get more sun through the day. It may get sun earlier in the day. The snowpack may melt off more quickly in the season. That's going to make that sap taste different. So this bit on the left here, the map of maple, is an attempt to capture that terroir idea and apply it to maple syrup. Notes of grass and plum and old leather and the kind of stuff that a lot of people think of as pretentious when talking about wines. This is an attempt to apply that to maple syrup. I'm seeing a couple of you grimace in the audience. Why? What feels grimacy about this for maple? Yeah. That same pretense. Think this dude is going to talk about jammy and plummy and notes of leather and new mown hay? No. This is the image. This is the story that maple wants to tell quite often. This, sorry, that's my finisher. Hang on. This doesn't feel like a maple-y story. It doesn't feel rural. This feels urban. This feels cosmopolitan. This feels highfalutin, to use a term from where I come from. This doesn't really fit maple very well for a lot of people. This was an attempt to try to provide a different kind of vocabulary for people to market their maple syrup. A few people sort of bit down on this and took it up and used it to market their maple. A lot of sugar makers, most of the sugar makers I talked to, and not by a close percentage, looked at that and went, yeah, we're good. I'm okay with calling it fancy. Although the grading system has changed too. That's a different story for another day. But this didn't really fit. Because it didn't fit that narrative of the lone dude in the red check coat with the horse team and the buckets. This was an attempt to create a marketing vocabulary. So again, getting back to what you said earlier, they want to sell the syrup. They want to evoke that dude in the red check coat with the horse team to sell the syrup. These are not contradictory narratives. These are narratives that inform one another, that inflect one another. These are layers of meanings that bump into one another, which again is the natural, normal way we human beings go about doing this stuff. This one didn't fit. This one was a contradiction. This one didn't feel like it fit with any of the other narratives, to the point that a lot of people felt like this is going to prevent me from selling that syrup. So this was largely ignored by a lot of people. There are a few people who took it up, but it didn't have quite the big impact that the folks who sort of worked on it were picturing it might. It had some, but yeah, not nearly as much. I do want to finish up here because there's no way to possibly talk about all the meanings of maple. Just to very self-servingly talk about my table of contents. I got chapters in here about the economic meanings, the culinary meanings. We didn't even talk about the sweet reward that you gave us right at the top. This stuff is food. It's aesthetic. We taste it. We enjoy it quite often. There are some people who don't like maple syrup, and fair play. But for people who like it, it's a very particular, very enjoyable flavor. So it has a culinary aesthetic aspect to it that informs all of this too. The hard work only matters, only meaningful if we enjoy that sweet reward at the end. So that becomes a meaning that makes it worth plunking down this much money for real maple as opposed to this much for log cabin. The geographic meanings, we touched a little bit on that. The rurality, the outline map of Vermont. The ecological meanings of maple. We didn't really talk about that. But if you think about maple's story, maple is very often thought of as a better sugar, and better can be defined different ways. In the current moment, people will talk about things like glycemic index, and a source of sweetness that has a lower glycemic index is better for you, it's more healthful. Okay, well, we can tell that story. If you reel back a couple hundred years, better was thought of in a moral/economic sense. Thomas Jefferson is quite well known for having talked about maple syrup as America's sugar and free sugar. And what he meant by that was a couple of things. Most of the sugar that was being used in what at the time was the colonies was primarily sugarcane derived, and it was made with the labor of enslaved people in the Caribbean. So Thomas Jefferson was saying, well, no, this is a sugar that we can make here without enslaving people and exploiting their labor. So it was free sugar in his mind. It was also American because it was being made on, in his mind, American soil. There's a similar kind of narrative that you'll hear today when people talk about energy independence. Let's make energy at home. Let's make sugar at home. It's the exact same narrative with a lot of the same complex sort of influences informing it. And there's a whole host of other ecological meanings that go into maple as well. The agricultural meaning of maple, the heritage meaning of maple. Maple is a cultural artifact. And like every cultural artifact, maple ain't special here, like every cultural artifact, it has many, many meanings that inform, inflect, interject, sometimes conflict with one another. And that's the normal state of affairs of human culture. That's how we think, how we communicate, how we enact ourselves and each other to form community. And that all results in maple being incredibly meaningful to Vermont. Now, she symbolizes this better than anything I could ever say. I'm going to finish on a little bit of story. This is a baby. You all probably knew that part. This is the baby of a couple of friends of mine. This is a man and a woman couple. He was born in Minnesota. She was born in Michigan. I'll actually reverse those so it's facing you. Minnesota, Michigan, right? He was born in Minnesota. She was born in Michigan. They both went to school to become librarians. He got a job at the school where I teach now. She got a job at Norwich University. They didn't know each other. They hadn't met. So they were both working in Vermont as academic librarians. They met at some librarian conference. I don't know what librarians do when they get together, but I'm, good for them. But they met at a librarian conference. They figured, oh, you're kind of cool. Hey, so are you. So they started hanging out. They started dating. They fell in love. They got married. They did all this while living in Vermont. Then she came along. I trust you all know how that happens. They wanted to, I like how you're nodding in the back, yeah. They wanted to move closer to family. So she got a job in the academic library at the University of Michigan, very close to where she grew up. And about a year later, he got a job in a different part of the academic library system at the University of Michigan. So they now live in Ann Arbor. But they met in Vermont. They dated in Vermont. They fell in love in Vermont. They got married in Vermont. They wanted to mark all of the importance of Vermont to them as a couple, to their life together, to their family. So when she came along, they named her Sylvie Maple. Her middle name is Maple. If that doesn't tell you how meaningful Vermont and maple are to one another, I don't know what does. Thank you all very much for listening to me, Amber, tonight. I appreciate it. If anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to, yeah, go for it. Sylvie comes from roots that are in like Sylvan and such. It also sounds like silver, and silver maple is a species of maple. Acer sylvestris, I think it is. Actually, I think that's wrong now that I say it out loud. But yeah, so it's definitely evoking as well. Yeah. Yeah, when they told me about what her name was going to be, I was, oh, well done. I was kind of jealous. What else? Yeah, go for it. Mm. Yeah. Hmm. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I come from a farming sort of area. I didn't grow up on a farm, but I grew up among farms. And there is something very familiar about the farming sense of, yes, this is hard graft work, it's heritage, it's history, it's my family, and it's money. Those two things are not contradictory for farmers in general. And interestingly, the chapter in here, agricultural meanings, when I first started doing this research on maple, one of the things that I quickly realized was that maple is very much an agricultural thing in Vermont, except I didn't understand it that way. I thought maple is an agricultural thing, period. Until I was on a bus tour. There's a thing in Vermont called Maple Rama. Has anybody ever heard of it? I know it's sort of a silly name, but it's a fascinating, wonderful thing. Maple Rama is kind of a conference, kind of a trade show, but it's a place, it's an event, rather, where sugar makers get together to talk amongst themselves. Maple festivals, maple sort of exhibits and things, sugar house visits, they're maple talking to the public. But Maple Rama is a place where the sugar makers get together and talk amongst themselves. It's a chance for them to swap tips, compare different systems, talk about how, oh, you do it this way, you do it that way, because no two sugaring operations are the same. That, again, is like agriculture. Everybody has a particular set of variables they've put together in a certain way. And they like to talk to one another about that. They like to see, oh, you switched over to wood pellets. How's that ramped up your efficiency? Oh, you're using that new tap track system. How's that helped out yours? Oh, you've jacked up the PSI in your vacuum system. How's that working? They want to talk about this. Maple Rama is a chance for them to kind of close the public out so they don't have to start with the 40-to-1 narrative, and they can get right to the nitty-gritty that they all share and in understanding. I went to Maple Rama for quite a few years. I haven't been in a few years now, but I went to Maple Rama for quite a few years, and I was quite often the only person there who didn't tap trees. When two sugar makers meet, the first thing they ask is, oh, where's your sugar bush? How many taps do you have? How many taps you got? I actually don't tap maple. Are you in the right place? Are you on the right bus? And then I would talk about researching maple, and they go, really? But they were very welcoming. They were very warm and very generous with their time, their thoughts, their expertise, their wisdom, their analysis. But part of Maple Rama is taking bus tours. It rotates around Vermont. There are 12 county-level sugar makers associations in Vermont. 2 of the counties in Vermont don't have one of their own. But each county takes a turn hosting Maple Rama. And as part of the event, it's usually a weekend thing, they will load up buses and they will visit 5 or 6 or 7 different sugar houses. So people can actually get into a sugar house and say, oh, you've got a steam boiler. That's really cool. I've never seen one of those. Oh, you're burning gasification. What's going on there? And they can talk with the person and they can see it live and in kind of in action. It was on one of these bus tours that in between sugar houses, I happened to be sitting on the bus behind a young couple. They were, I would guess, about 25, comparatively young couple. And turns out they were from Maine. And we were just sort of jabbering back and forth, as you do. And I said, "Yet understand." So it's knowledge that you can hopefully politely ask for. And so I said, "Oh, what's going on? What are you thinking about?" And what came out of our conversation before we hit the next sugar house was the whole idea of sugaring being an agricultural thing didn't make any sense to them, because for them in Maine, sugaring was connected with the forestry industry, not with agriculture. And I stewed on that a little bit, and I thought, okay, I can see that making some sense, because who are the people who are among the trees in Vermont? It's farmers, it's hill farmers. Historically speaking, the people who came and made maple after the Abenaki were people who settled on hill farms, because that's where the trees were. Much of the agriculture in Vermont is hill farming. That's why it's mostly herd, not a whole lot of crop in comparison. Where I come from in Ohio, crop. But here it's animals, because you don't want to try to sow or harvest wheat on an angle like that. But the cows, yeah, you can call them home and they're good to go. So it was the dairy farmers who were in among the trees, because they were the ones who were on that land. In Maine, the people who were in among the trees were the foresters, the logging industry. And so for this young couple, they equated, or at least associated, maple with logging, not with agriculture. And I thought, well, that's really interesting, because in my mind, it was this agricultural thing. And so a lot of the sort of patterns and norms and culture of farming that I was familiar with, I was kind of bringing to the table. And it turns out, yeah, that works at Vermont's table, not so much in other places maybe. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Farmers always have that sense of work and nostalgia and money. They're all sitting around the table together. That's never been a thing that they're shy of. But that didn't translate quite as well into Maine, where farming wasn't part of the story, at least in the same way. Other questions? Other thoughts? How many people are hankering for a short stack with some syrup on it now? No. That was an unintentional plug there, but fair enough. Mm-hmm. Mm. You'll find versions of it elsewhere, absolutely. I will happily go on record at risk of my life and limb as saying anybody who's making genuine real maple syrup, no matter where it is, it's good stuff. It's going to vary. It'll be different. But I have not had real proper maple syrup that is bad. I've had some that I like more than others, because those tasting notes exist for a reason. Maple does vary. But I've never had some that's out and out bad. Some of the stuff that people tried to make in Newfoundland, actually, there was one person who, she tapped like 3 or 4 maple trees on her property, and she just boiled it in her kitchen in a pot. And she put it on to just a bare simmer and left it there for, I think she said 6 days. And what she brought in was clear. It had absolutely no color whatsoever. And she presented it and said, this is interesting. Did I do this right? And I kind of tasted it and went, no. But here's how and why. You need a certain temperature to create various chemical reactions. Some of you might be familiar with the Maillard reaction. It's a thing that happens to sugars when you get them up to a certain temperature. They break and recombine in ways that create flavors, charring on meat, browning on vegetables. If you brown onions and then scrape up the stuff, deglaze the pan, that is the Maillard reaction in action. Maillard is one of the things that happens in maple sap that creates some of the flavors in maple syrup. And because she put it on a simmer for nearly a week, instead of boiling it hard, she didn't reach that temperature. And so she never quite got to some of those chemical reactions that were needed to make something taste like maple syrup. It was thick. It had the consistency, the viscosity, but it had none of the flavor. It was very strange. It was a sort of a dissociating experience for me. But the local pride, well, let me put it this way. There was a moment and I say a moment, is a few decades long, of industrialization in the 19th century, sort of very late 18th, sort of to mid 19th century, where some state identities kind of got solidified. That's when Vermont became a maple state. That's when Wisconsin became a dairy state. That's when these kind of things that became agricultural identities really sort of formed up. And some of the reason for that is that's when you have trains and technologies that allow Vermont's butter and Vermont's milk and Vermont's cheese, I'm sorry, Wisconsin's butter and Wisconsin's milk and Wisconsin cheese to suddenly be sold and available in Philadelphia. And so, oh, Wisconsin must mean cheese, becomes a narrative that exists outside of Wisconsin. Oh, Vermont must mean maple, suddenly can exist outside of Vermont in a bigger way. It could before, but that really ramped up the process. And so the connection of place and, in this case, agricultural product really becomes solidified in this moment. And that becomes the root of some of these, what we think of as the local pride in X commodity. Wisconsin, I went to grad school in Wisconsin, so I feel free to say this. Wisconsin calls itself a dairy state. It doesn't make the most milk. It doesn't make the most butter. It does still make the most cheese. So they've, still got a niche for themselves. But California makes way more milk than Wisconsin's ever going to again, probably. But nobody says, oh, California, the dairy state. That's Wisconsin, because when the identity got fixed in that moment in the past, that's what Wisconsin was known for. And the knowing, the meaning, was spreading outside of Wisconsin. So you get similar kinds of connections of place and stuff, if I could be so technical about it, in different places. But it's at least partly based around that particular intersection of an agricultural moment and an industrial moment, transportation technologies, that allowed that meaning to be moved, to be exported from the state. Yeah. Yeah, go for it.
So he from Canada.
Yeah.
And I'm just not, I'm also from the Midwest
Mm-hmm.
and just moved here. And it seems to be the only one that doesn't identify place is labeling outside of the French, which I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like also portrays a lot of the Quebec mindset. But is that normal or is that just because I keep
There is some very tiny writing up here, but it doesn't talk about the place. Interestingly, this container was made in Swanton, Vermont, just across just south of the Quebec border. But there is a different kind of relationship. I've talked to quite a few sugar makers from Quebec as well, and there's a different kind of relationship between maple and Canada and maple and Quebec that is, I'm trying to think how to phrase this. It's less hyper-localized. Probably partly due to the Confederation, which is this enormous cooperative economic entity that I mentioned before. There are a whole bunch of, it's kind of like Cabot cheese or Cabot dairies. A bunch of dairy farmers own and provide their milk to the cooperative, and they then make secondary things like milk, cheese, butter, whatever. The Confederation in Quebec does the same thing for maple. A whole bunch of maple producers belong to the Confederation. The Confederation gets the vast majority of their maple syrup, and then they represent it out to the world as Quebec syrup. Vermont, I was about to say Vermont can't do that. That's not entirely true. There are bulk packers who, on a much smaller scale, will get a bunch of maple syrups from different people and sort of resell it. Butternut Mountain does that. There are a few of them in Vermont. But do we have any whiskey drinkers in the audience? You don't have to say that. Oh, you look on your face says yes, absolutely. Scotch whiskeys. You got single malts, you got blends. Yeah. A single malt Scotch whiskey is made in a place at a time, and it tastes particular. Blends take whiskeys from all over the place, blend them, as the name might suggest, and try to create a recognizable and consistent flavor across years and across entire bottlings. Quebec is a blend. Vermont sells the single malt. of maple because they need the particularity in order to stand out. They're never going to compete with Quebec in just terms of raw numbers. 70%, north of 70% every year. But Vermont can sell you the single malt. Quebec syrup is very good stuff. I am not down talking Quebec syrup. But a lot of it is this blended, and it is literally blended quite often, to create a very good, very high quality, consistent flavor. But Vermont can make you taste that valley right there. I don't know how many sugar makers I've talked to who literally know their trees as individuals. I've never met one who names them like people name their cars or their pets. I bet some of them do, they just didn't tell that to me. But they know their trees. Oh yeah, that tree, that's gonna be my first runner this year. That one, she's on her way out. That tree's dying. I'll probably get 10 more years out of her, but not much after that. That tree, last year, not so much, but this year's gonna be great because we had a lot more early sun. They know their trees in this individual way. And that individuality, that particularity of place is something that Vermont has in abundance and also needs in order to make that taste of place a more meaningful meaning. All right, I think I've kept you all up long enough. I very much appreciate you coming out and listening to me yammer for a little bit. Thank you to everybody at home as well. Go home, have some maple syrup, and hopefully find it a little bit meaningful. Thank you very much.